Reflections with theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio.
So when you think of theology as reflection in a systematic way upon the great human questions, then we begin to see its parallels with the world of literature. I guess where we would look at literature as being a way of raising those questions, where the universal themes come out.
Joining Father Bacik in today's reflections is Sister Pat Schnapp, Associate Pastor at St. Thomas More University Parish in Bowling Green, Ohio.
I think one of the advantages of the literature was that it allowed us to probe the questions in ways maybe that we ordinarily don't see or feel, and let the students into a world maybe that they were not quite yet familiar with, or a world that they were going to meet later on.
Today's Reflections focuses on the topic of religion in literature. Here's Father Bacik.
Pat, I thought it would be good, since you and I have recently been cooperating on a course called Religion and Literature, if we talked about that topic a little bit, the relationship between theology and modern literature. I know one of the things that I liked in doing the course was the fact that the literature very often gave graphic ways of dealing with great human problems. The authors that we discussed seemed to raise the great human issues, but to do it in a way that our students could relate to. They felt the power of it. They could identify with various characters and so on. And it seemed as though it was a wonderful entree into the whole discussion of the great human questions. In that way, seems like theology and literature are of about the same business. Theology is probing the relationship between God and humankind. The divine-human relationship from all of its aspects is the subject of theological discourse. And literature seems to do that same thing. Now, I realize that theology does something more than that. Theology also has a history. It is an attempt to take the Christian symbol system as we know it and relate it to a given culture. It's about the business of reinterpreting the traditional terminology, so we have to talk in the field of theology about redemption and grace and the Trinity and the Incarnation and the sacraments and so on. And we have to look and see how those notions were developed throughout history. So theology has its technical vocabulary and has its sort of in-house business of reinterpreting the common Christian doctrines and of making them relevant and intelligible for people today. But there's another way of looking at theology, which is simply the reflection upon the human situation, an attempt to systematically analyze who we are as graced people, to think about the common faith that we share in a careful, analytical kind of way. So when you think of theology as reflection in a systematic way upon the great human questions, then we begin to see its parallels with the world of literature. I guess where we would look at literature as being a way of raising those questions, where the universal themes come out and where the great human questions are wrestled with. I think one of the advantages of the literature was that it allowed us to probe the questions in ways maybe that we ordinarily don't see or feel, and let the students into a world maybe that they were not quite yet familiar with, or a world that they were going to meet later on. I wonder if we're talking here a little abstractly. I mean, since we did this course together and it's the basis of our discussion, probably ought to go back over the works that we did deal with. We dealt with Hemingway, Old Man and the Sea, and F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, and John Steinbeck, The Red Pony, and Tennessee Williams' Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. And what we were trying to do is analyze those books from the perspective of the theme of salvation. We were trying to see how those various authors raised the problem of salvation. What was the great human problem? What are people generally struggling with? And then what those authors' solution was to it.
Well said, Jim. I think a lot of people tend to think that literature is frivolous, that theology, of course, is heavy and serious, And yet, basically, theology and literature are both, if seriously undertaken, a task. And that is, they are both groping for understanding of, as you put it, the big human questions. We find this true even in a lot of the songs of our day, songs that are not often marked by an intelligent probing of deep issues, but songs like, "What's It All About, Elfie? Do you know where you're going to? Is that all there is?" Songs in which someone is seriously asking precisely what we expect to find answers to in theology, and what our great writers are constantly having their characters ask. They're people in search of meaning. I think that literature has a marvelous tradition in our own Judaic Christian culture. Jesus used the parable, the story, as a way to convey a message. The Old Testament is just chock full of delightful stories, funny stories, violent stories. There's a story for every kind of temperament and personality. We like to read it because of its stories. There's something in our psyche that seems to be grabbed by a story. And it is a lot easier for the average person on the street to relate to a story than to relate to, for instance, a theological treatise. And since they both deal rather seriously with what we are all about as human persons, I think that accounts for the enduring popularity of even written literature, even in this era of television.
It's interesting the way our students latched on to particular characters in the novels, wasn't it? And the way they would discuss them and maybe identify with them in some way, or see how they represented a particular outlook or perspective in life. Thinking of Cat on a Hot Tin Roof and the great argument we had about Maggie, one of the main characters in that play.
Whether or not she really loved Brick or was simply money hungry and was hanging in there for the sake of the inheritance she expected him to soon receive.
Yeah, that was a lively discussion. As I recall it broke down along male-female lines about whether one was sympathetic to Maggie. I think that the men in the group generally thought that Maggie was just out to get the money and was domineering and power-hungry and maybe really wasn't all that in love with her husband, whose name was Brick.
But the women who have more intuition and more compassion felt with Maggie and saw her as a much more favorable character, as much more warm and sincere. I found that very interesting, too.
I guess, isn't it true with the great figures in literature that they have that power? They seem to be able to touch people in various ways. I guess we notice that generally in the discussions, that you take the same event that's described and people would just see it from another perspective because they bring their own experience to it.
I certainly think that is true. I was struck by the fact that a number of students, however, were disturbed with the works that we studied because they felt that the novels, or in the case of Williams, the play, raised a lot of heavy questions but did not offer obvious solutions. And this was for the students disturbing. And a couple, in fact, said, why read literature when Jesus has given us the answers? Why do we need all this garbage, basically?
I think it reminded me of Paul Tillich's analysis of the relationship between theology and the Christian faith and modern literature or modern philosophy. His notion was that the artistic world did set the question for us, raised the problem, that what modern art, modern literature was doing was showing us the alienation that we face as modern human beings, the estrangement from ourselves, from other people, and ultimately from our God. In other words, his notion was that art and philosophy as well, especially existentialism and psychotherapy out of the Freudian tradition, that all of that line of thought simply raised the questions, that's what they were good for, but they had no solutions to give. And his notion was that Christianity and the revealed revelation, what we have in the Bible and the Christian tradition, provided us with the answers then. So he liked to look at that world of 20th century through the eyes of the artist because it would sharpen the problem. And if you stop and think about modern art, for example, very often you get the distorted images and the lack of coherence and meaning in the particular painting, or apparent meaning, I should say. It's raising the question for us. And I think that the novels and the play that we dealt with seemed to do that. In a way, I agreed with the students that way. It seemed like the authors were usually stronger on the problem than on any kind of viable solution. But to me, that's extremely valuable. I'm often saying that Christianity seems to be giving answers to questions that no one is asking. In other words, unless we spend time with the problem and feel the problem and sense it, we don't know what Christianity is all about. After all, the world's great religious traditions claim to be salvation vehicles. What they're basically telling us is that there's something wrong with us. The world is messed up in some way. We are flawed, and therefore we need salvation. You can't appreciate the message of the Bible unless you feel something about limitation in the human situation. We can't appreciate the saving work of Jesus Christ unless we feel that we need saved from something. We have to have some sense of our alienation, estrangement, our sinfulness, so that while I felt that the literature we dealt with was in many ways limited, it was excellent, tremendous for raising the problems.
I would certainly agree with that. And I think, too, that perhaps some of the frustration of the students might be the fact that they are still young, they are not too far removed from their children's literature, in which, of course, there always was a solution, in which being good and sticking with a job would lead one to success. They have been TV-oriented from childhood, and again, the TV world is the world where problems are, in fact, always solved, that a certain amount of perhaps raw courage or initiative or enterprise or luck will lead one in 30 or 60 minutes solution, and evil will be put down and good will triumph. And the man will ride off west in his horse, and everybody will live happily ever after. And I think it's difficult to get that out of our bones, that sense that there ought to be a solution, that somehow suffering should not just happen apparently meaninglessly, that someone should not be forced to face his death and not have some sort of triumphal belief that this is not the end, that he should not have to face that sort of horror. And perhaps their own experiences have not yet touched them into to the problem deeply enough that they are prepared to be more receptive to possible answers. I was thinking of a building on the outskirts of Lima along I-75, and pale blue plastic immense are the words, "Christ is the answer." And I smile every time I drive past it, because I'm saying to myself, but how many people are even asking the question?
Yes, I felt that was one of the valuable things that the literature did for us, was to raise the questions. But do you remember there were times when the students would sense that we were dealing with a slice of life in one way or another, where it seemed as though it was enough to allow the story to illumine a particular situation? I'm thinking of The Red Pony and Steinbeck, where he's talking about this young lad, Jody, who's, 10 to 12 years old, and is interacting with his father and with a hired hand on their farm, and where you just get a little slice of life. You don't really get much of a resolution of the problem. You get these magnificent descriptions and so on, and you're watching Jody, you're seeing the story through the eyes of this youngster, and you're getting the picture of his development as a young person, his growing moral awareness in a sense. And where you don't get a resolution of the problem, but you do see more clearly something about life. In this case, I think not just the problem of life. What was he trying to deal with? The problem of fallibility, right? He had to deal with the question that his father was limited, that his father was not a perfect person, that his father treated his grandfather badly, for example. He had to deal with the fact that the hired hand couldn't save the horse that was so important to Jody, and so that he had to come to grips with the limitations of those significant adults in his life. Well, I think very often the students seem to like that particular story because they could see it lighting up something about their own life. The problem, in this case, of dealing with limitation, of the finitude of all of the other people in our lives.
Well, I think another reason why that story was the most satisfying for many of them, Jim, is because in that particular story, the problems did seem to have some sort of happy resolution. Through the traumatic experiences Jody undergoes, he does mature, he does become a sensitive young man. he grows in compassion for the elderly, for his grandfather, for Gitano, the old man who's going to ride off into the mountains to die. I think we don't see the same sort of happy resolution to the problems in the other stories, and that therefore they were less satisfying for that reason. And you're certainly on the mark in saying that they are a slice of life. But I suspect that deep down what was wanted was a little bit more sense that there was purpose and meaning to all the pain that we saw in the other stories.
Mm-hmm. I guess I didn't sense the same sort of resolution that you're talking about in the Red Pony, but now when you say it, I can see it in that way. I guess the slice of life was limited. I mean, you didn't see the boy's final development or how he grew up or have a happy ending to the whole story. But I see what you mean, that there was progress, and maybe then one saw the progress in the youngster and could feel good about that. In other words, the great ending where he wants to give some lemonade to his grandfather, isn't that it? And
right.
He does it, and his mother says, well, you're doing it, you want to give lemonade to him so you can get some for yourself. And the lad says, no, I just want to give it to my grandfather here, because he had developed a sensitivity for his grandfather. Now, one of the things I've noticed about the literature is that it is engaging. In other words, it is so much more concrete. I suppose one of the things we always say about theology is that it's too abstract, that it flies off into language that no one understands, use categories that no one recognizes anymore, and that people have trouble following it. And I suppose the advantage of the literature is that we have concrete figures to latch onto, real symbols that collect our thoughts. You remember when Anthony Padovano was in Bowling Green this past quarter also, and was discussing literature, and I noticed in his lecture, I sat in the back of the hall, and as he was talking about some important problems that we humans face, he would turn to examples from literature and talk about a particular character in a graphic way, for example, and follow the character through particular stories. And I noticed, watching the audience, that people were very intrigued by that, very much into it, and they were very much with it. And then when he would go off into more abstract theology, then he would lose the audience. Yeah, he would begin to look at their watches and wonder when it was going to end. And I thought, what a marvelous lesson for those of us who dabble in theology. I thought that the whole experience of teaching the course was very good for me that way, to see another approach to dealing with the great human questions.
I think it's pretty interesting that drama was revived in the Middle Ages through the churches in an attempt to educate and move the hearts of the people. And we had the very interesting morality plays, for instance, in which different characters would simply be personified virtues and vices. And I think in modern literature, certainly in some of the works we studied, one could see this also continuing. You could certainly see, I think, The Great Gatsby as a modern morality play, and Daisy would be money, of course. In fact, the Buchanans would be money personified.
I think that was one of my favorite ones. Just say more about that one. Great Gatsby.
Well, it was not my favorite one. No. Would you like to say why it was your favorite one, Jim?
It was on television recently, too. I think I've seen the movie 3 times.
Yes,
I think it was
you like Robert Redford.
I don't think that was the real reason, but I think it portrayed this American dream in some way that I think is so important in our culture. Fitzgerald links up Gatsby's own struggle in life and his own dreaminess, idealism, and so on with the American dream itself. And I think he properly brings out the ambivalence of that dream. There's something really good about it. The American dream of having a culture where there is equality for all people, where there's freedom, where we have the opportunity to grow and develop, the planting of the kingdom right here. I mean, there's something really vibrant and good about that. I mean, I love the way Martin Luther King revived that in his speech, I Have a Dream, which is based on our American dream and the call to live that out, to fulfill this great dream. On the other hand, we could see the problems involved in the dream when it got tied up with wealth, of just getting ahead in a socio-economic sense. When it got out of touch with reality, I suppose. That was one of Gatsby's problems, right? He wasn't in touch with reality. Here was this girl that he knew many years before who had married another man, and he still thought that he could win her over and that he could do it through his own wealth and social advancement, and how unreal that was. He wanted to live in the past. What is the line? And I always forget the exact words, but he says, somebody
You can't
says to
repeat the
Gatsby,
past?
yeah, they say to Gatsby, well, you can't repeat the past, and Gatsby says,
Of course you can. Why, of course you can.
of course you can repeat the past. I mean, he was living in that past, and he wasn't in touch with reality, so that gives the other side of it. So I guess that's one of the reasons I like the story so much. It dealt with the cultural problem, which I think is so real for us, of the American dream, and instead of just saying it's all crummy and getting cynical about it, or on the other hand of saying that it is all pure and lily white and so on, I like the sense of the mixture about it, the good and the bad. Yes.
Yeah, certainly all the authors we studied were in the realist tradition, and it does seem that they are imposing a sort of a reality therapy on us with regard to the frailty of the American dream. Things do fall apart. No matter how well things go, there are many other factors beyond our control. We're going to grow older. We're going to lose our power, as the old man in the sea did. We will eventually have to face sickness or death. And we can't turn these realities around. We have to come to grips with them. And I think it was interesting for us and helpful for us to see how these fictional characters, but characters probably in most cases that were drawn from the lives of the authors, how they attempted to cope with the contingencies of life that we simply can't do anything about and have to deal with.
Yes. I suppose we have to admit that there were some solutions in the novels as well. I don't really totally go along with Paul Tillich's idea that I was talking about later, that the culture gives us only questions and problems, and that the Christian revelation is the only thing that can give us answers. I believe that the modern world produces some of its own answers as well, that we find elements of God's grace in the world. So I would expect to look at the works of art and to find in them intimations of God's presence, some signals of hope in those as well. And therefore, in the literature, I wouldn't expect them just to raise problems, but to say something helpful about the human situation. And I think we found that. I think in Hemingway's notion of the old man in the sea, where he's out and catching the fish, and the old man seems to represent a Christ figure, really. But the old man perdures Hemingway's great idea of grace under pressure, that he follows the code, and he goes through all of the rituals that he's supposed to do, and all the wisdom he's gained over the years in catching the fish. He brings all that to bear on catching this great fish. And I think there's a great message in there of perseverance, of sticking to the little things in the times of crisis, of continuing to hope. Even he went out fishing, even though for 80-some days or whatever it was that he didn't catch any fish, he stuck with that he had a good sense of the young lad that he interacted with. So I believe that in the novels there were answers as well. But I think from the Christian perspective, not complete answers.
Yes, I'd certainly go along with that. I think we shouldn't forget Hemingway's great line in that story that a man can be destroyed but not defeated.
Mm-hmm.
That man has this capacity for greatness, for immense dignity. And in that greatness and in that dignity, of course, there are those signals of transcendence that you were talking about, I think. Big Daddy and Cat in a Hot Tin Roof suggests that people don't go to death the way animals do, for instance.
You know, I was thinking that the theology has learned something from literature already, in a sense. There's a movement that we call narrative theology these days, story theology, which emphasizes the fact that the Christian message has come to us through story form, as you suggested very well at the beginning, I think, looking at the Hebrew Scriptures to find the brilliant stories there of all types of human problems and so on. And then the fundamental story that keeps being told about Jesus is through the New Testament, going back to the great action that God has done for us in the person of Jesus. And that has a drama about it. Jesus' interaction with other people, his befriending of individuals, his fight with the establishment and so on. The great wonder of the disciples with the resurrection of Jesus. In a sense, that's what Christians have done for 2,000 years, is to repeat the story, to tell it over and over. And a lot of what modern theology is trying to do is to get people today to tell their own stories, to be in touch with the way that God's grace is working in their own life, to take their own experience seriously, and to be willing to tell other people about that story, to witness to the truth that God is active in their own life. This seems to really be a powerful vehicle for bringing forth the truth. So in many ways, theology might not be as abstract as it has seemed for a period of time. Moving into the story form, I think, is very helpful, because when we begin to tell it the story, we bring out the emotional side of it. We bring out the concreteness of our life. We're in touch with the particular facts, because as Christians, what we really end up believing is that God speaks to us through the world. Christianity is not an abstract doctrine, after all. It is not a philosophy of life in any way, not limited to a philosophy of life. It is a concrete, historical, particular religion. It is based on the belief that God has spoken to us through Jesus, who is the absolute Savior and the final prophet, through an historical individual who lived in a particular time and place. And so Christians say we are dedicated to that Lord Jesus. We believe that He has the key to life. Therefore, theology ought to have this kind of concreteness. I think we can continue to learn, therefore, from the world of literature. I love that notion of the story, and of thinking of the characters in the story, of thinking the way people are reacting to life and so on. And maybe in the whole presentation of Christianity, if we kept that more in mind, we would really be better off. People would then hear it not as something vague and off in the clouds or something, but as something that really relates to our life, that tells us something about where we're going, and does so in terminology that we can appreciate and feel and really be in touch with. So I think this religion and literature dialogue is really an important one, and I think it was great to be able to do that course, and I think it shows possibilities for the future in many ways.
You've been listening to Reflections with your host, theologian Father James Bacik, lecturer and campus minister at Bowling Green State University in Bowling Green, Ohio. Joining Father Bacik in this discussion was Sister Pat Schnapp, associate pastor at St. Thomas More University Parish in Bowling Green, Ohio. The topic of this week's Reflections was Religion in Literature. If you have any comments about today's program or any ideas for topics you'd like to hear discussed, please write to Reflections in the care of WLQR, Toledo, Ohio, 43623. Produced in the studios of WLQR, Reflections is directed by Mark Ferguson. Executive producer is Mary Beth Kirchner. Reflections is brought to you by the Genesis Radio Network in cooperation with the Diocese of Toledo.